Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. David Howden about Austrian business cycle theory. Dr. Howden is chair of the Department of Business and Economics and professor of economics at St. Louis University's Madrid campus. He is also the academic vice president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Canada. He is the editor of the journal Prices and Markets and a co-author with Philip Baggis of Deep Freeze, Iceland's Economic Collapse. You can follow his work at the Mises Canada website at mises.ca. That's MISES.ca. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Austrian-cycle. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining me. So before we dive into Austrian business cycle theory, let's just start out with Austrian economics in general. So what is Austrian economics, and how would you describe the origins of that school of thought?
Well, Austrian economics, the biggest differentiating factor between it and what we might call the mainstream approach to economics, or the predominant approach to economics, is really in the method. So Austrians believe that there are several categories of action, things that we do, which are universally true. And we use these universal truths to build theories that then have to be true as well. If you start from a fundamental truth and you use correct logical arguments, the output or the result also has to be true. And so this method that we use in economics is very much based on deductive logic, where we demonstrate things that have to be true, or economic theories that have to be true, which is very much different from how the mainstream conceptualizes the method in economics, which is more based on inductive logic, on looking at events that have happened and then after the fact trying to describe how they happened. Statistical analysis, for example, would be one of the things you would look for in that type of economic analysis, while Austrians in general wouldn't rely on facts and statistical analysis after the fact. We would know that our theories are true without actually testing them.
Okay, and you obviously just started to get into this, but can you elaborate a little more on how the Austrian School of Economics differs with other schools of economic thought?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to use a specific example, a very good example would be how we treat minimum wage. So in standard economic analysis, you would have a situation where you would say, well, in the labor market, there is a wage rate which equilibrates supply with demand. So at a certain wage rate, there is the exact same amount of people who want that job as there is firms who want to hire somebody to do that job. And if you put a minimum wage which differs from that equilibrium wage rate, and the common example would be, what if the wage rate is too high? Then we would say, well, at that too high of a minimum wage, there is an excess demand of people who want to work for that amount of money relative to the amount of firms that want to hire. And those people that make up the difference are unemployed people. So and we're all aware of this. If you increase the minimum wage, like what's the plan right now? Certain states are talking about increasing it to $15 an hour or something like that. Of course, if you increase it to $15 an hour, I can imagine many, many, many people who would want to go out there and get a job, people who aren't looking for a job actively right now. And at the same time, you would have fewer businesses that actually want to hire those workers. So you would have unemployed workers as a result. And the Austrians, we look at all this and we would say, well, just because of the way that we have defined the demand for work and the supply of jobs and what the wage rate actually is, we know that any minimum wage which is above the equilibrium wage rate will cause unemployment. But the mainstream will look at this and they'll say, well, let's go out and get data and let's see if increases of the minimum wage actually do result in increases in unemployment. And there might be circumstances or situations where they can see that it's not entirely true, that maybe a state increased its minimum wage and unemployment went down, and they would conclude then that the minimum wage was actually positive for the employment situation. It didn't cause people to lose their job. It caused more firms to hire workers. And they can give various reasons to explain this, but maybe just for the sake of the argument now, the difficulty with this approach is that there are so many variables involved that it's difficult to isolate exactly why it is that unemployment would have went down at the same time as the minimum wage increased. And for Austrians, we know that this can't happen, that the direct effect, if you were to isolate it, the direct effect of an increase in the minimum wage would have to be fewer people working and more people unemployed. But for the mainstream, they would say, well, that could be a result, but also they've got all these other factors mixed in there as well. And so they'll make these isolated claims and they'll say, in these types of scenarios, increases in the minimum wage will cause fewer people to be out of work. But it's a difficult statement to make, if only for the reason that you can't isolate in these empirical analyses exactly what the reason for an event happening is. So they're stuck with this problem where they cannot say, as much as they want to, that the increase in minimum wage actually was the driving factor behind the decrease in unemployment.
All right, and so with Austrian economics seeming to be catching on more and more and being embraced by more people, both in economics and in the general society as a whole, it seems to me like there have been more criticisms of the Austrian school and more objections being raised as the school's popularity has grown. So what are some of the most common objections that you hear, and what would be some responses to those, and why do the differences that you just outlined between Austrian economics and these other schools work in favor of the Austrian school as opposed to in favor of some other school of thought?
Well, maybe to start with it's true that Austrian economics is much more popular now, and increasingly so than it was in the past. And I think one of the driving factors for this is its ability to describe events as we perceive them. So, for example, when I use Austrian economics in class, a way that we like to describe it, that Austrian economists describe it, is as causal realist economics. Causal realist in the sense that the economic phenomenon that we describe are real, like unemployment is a real phenomenon, and causal because we're actually trying to identify what in particular or what specifically are the factors that will cause or change unemployment. And it has faced more criticisms over the years, which I take as a good thing because, a couple of years ago it was just being ignored completely. So the criticisms that are coming now are quite positive because people are aware of what's going on, and they're really trying to get to the core of, what is different about Austrian economics, and it does differ from the mainstream or the orthodoxy. So if Austrian economics is right, it must mean that the orthodoxy is wrong. And if you're a member of the mainstream, then this is quite a problem. So one of the biggest criticisms that I encounter is the idea that because Austrian economists don't believe that they need to go out into the real world and observe actual market data in order to construct their theories, that they ignore market data. So, for example, in the situation that I just gave you, the differing approaches to understanding the relationship between minimum wage and the unemployment rate, Austrians would say there is no need to go out there and actually look for data about increases or maybe decreases, but probably increases in the minimum wage and the change that had actually brought about on the unemployment rate. They would say that we know without looking at the data that there has to be this positive relationship. We increase the minimum wage and more people will lose their jobs or be unemployed as a result of that. And for the mainstream, this is very strange because they're very data oriented. So they would say, yes, you can talk about that in theory, but shouldn't you go out there and actually test your theory to see if it's correct? Austrians, because we differ so much on the methodology, we would say, no, it's not necessary to actually test this theory. We know that it has to be true just by right of the fact that we have defined the demand for labor, the supply of labor, what the equilibrium wage rate is, and then using logical tools to deduce what the relationship is between changes in that wage rate through the minimum wage or through some other change and the unemployment rate. So we don't actually think that we need to test it. We don't think that we need to go out there and see data. And for the mainstream, this is very strange. So oftentimes I encounter these criticisms that, well, you guys, you don't go out and you don't do statistical analysis and you don't look at the data, so how do you know if your theories are actually true? And we counter that by saying, well, we know that our theories are true through our deductive logic and the fact that we start from true propositions.
All right, so let's move on to Austrian business cycle theory. And before we get there, how about a definition of what a business cycle is and what a business cycle theory is?
Well, a business cycle will be a general ebb and flow of the economy. So with business cycles, we're not talking about isolated industries having difficulties, or a business over here having an economic boom while that business over there is doing poorly. We need to look at, in general, all businesses going through a boom together and having conditions under which we would define as good business, positive economic growth, for example, and then generally diminishing or declining business activity. So a boom and then a recession going after it. So if you conceptualize the business cycle as first, there seeming to be an economic expansion, more people having jobs, the majority or all businesses operating under profitable conditions. And then eventually you reach a peak where the decline sets in, which is the recession, unemployment increasing, businesses closing up their doors, and things like that. So if that's the business cycle, the boom-bust cycle, if you will, the business cycle theory is a theory which tries to describe why it is that the boom turns to bust, or looking at what the relationship is between these two different stages of economic activity. And there we see big differences without even getting too in-depth as to what the Austrians think. We can see big differences between how the Austrians approach the problem in the mainstream. So, for example, the mainstream might look at a recession, and when the recession's happening, they would say, okay, well, we're in the middle of a recession. What is the problem right now, and how do we get out of it? While the Austrians, since they have a focus on these causal relationships, would say, no, what are the things that happened to cause the recession? And since the things that cause the recession must come before the recession actually happens, we would be looking at the boom phase as the source of the problems, to say, well, what happened during the boom that sowed the seeds, so to speak, for the recession that followed? You see the difference here. The mainstream would look at the recession as the problem in and of itself and look for solutions to get out of it, while the Austrians would say, no, the problems must have been created during the boom, which preceded the recession. Logically, that would have been the moment in time when the problems developed, and then they caused the recession to happen after the fact.
Sure. So can you flesh out a little more, in a little more detail, just what the Austrian business cycle theory is, and why, and more reasons why it might be preferable to other business cycle theories?
Yeah. First, I'll tell you what Austrian business cycle theory is not, because for any of your listeners, probably the most common way, if they've encountered Austrian business cycle theory before, the most common way that it gets described is also not entirely correct. So the way that it gets described is typically we have interest rates that govern how much people want to borrow and how much businesses want to expand. Right? You borrow if you're a business owner so that you can invest in your own business. And the typical way that Austrian business cycle theory gets described is as interest rates are lowered, they cause more firms to borrow money in order to expand business activity. And this causes what we can call an overinvestment. Too many people investing at the same time. And since they're spending their money on investments, they're not buying the finished goods that businesses are actually creating. And so this causes the boom to turn to bust, since the expenditures are not directed at anything that the business has created. They're directed towards investing in the business. So it commonly gets described like that. And to summarize it maybe most succinctly, you would talk about this as an overinvestment theory of the business cycle, that there's just too much investment taking place in the economy. That's the way it commonly gets sold, and it's a simplified version of what the Austrians are saying, and it's also fairly incorrect. And your listeners would probably, just in me briefly describing it there, probably feel that it must be incorrect because of the way you describe it. There's too much investment going on in the economy, and this is causing economic decline later. Because if you looked at your own personal finances, the idea of too much investment should strike you as very strange. Your future wealth, your own personal future economic growth, is going to be driven primarily by saving and investing today. And so the more that you invest, the more wealthy you'd be in the future. That's how we understand personal finances. And it should strike you as strange that then we would say, well, for the economy as a whole, this isn't true. Why is it that for the economy, too much investment would cause an economic decline in the future? So that's as a little background. That's how it's commonly understood. So now I'll tell you what Austrian business cycle theory actually is. So the interest rate serves a twofold purpose for Austrians. The first role that it serves is equilibrating suppliers and demanders of funds, of investable funds. So that's like saying, well, at some interest rate, you have the same amount of people saving and investing money as there are people looking to borrow and invest. That's non-controversial. The mainstream also would define the interest rate in terms of equilibrating saving and investment. But then the Austrians also make another claim, which is the interest rate also structures the amount of time that production processes happen for. So, for example, without maybe making it too technical, the lower the interest rate, the greater the value longer dated projects have. So maybe to give you a concrete example, you can, in your kitchen, if you went to make a sandwich, you could probably spend about 30 seconds whipping up a sandwich. It probably wouldn't be very good, but you'd have a sandwich nonetheless. Or you could go into your kitchen and you could toil for 10 minutes, and this increased amount of time that you spend making your sandwich would be able to produce a much more satisfying sandwich. You could extend the logic out to longer production processes. For example, Volkswagen could produce a car from start to finish, start being the designing, the research and development phase, to finish having a car roll off the assembly line. I'm sure that they could build a car in 2 months. It probably wouldn't be very good. There would be a lot of things that are underdeveloped, underdesigned, and poorly researched, but you'd have a car nonetheless. Or they could spend years doing their research, market research, getting the right materials and building a car, and the final output would be a much better vehicle, a much more satisfying product. So we make the claim that longer production processes are more satisfying. They produce better goods than shorter production processes. And the interest rate is the price, if you will, that communicates how long the production process is supposed to happen for, or how long the economy can sustain a production process. Because if you just keep taking this reasoning to the logical conclusion, you'd say, well, if I can build a better sandwich in 10 minutes than I could in 30 seconds, why don't I just spend a whole day making a ham sandwich, or a whole week, or something like that? Surely the sandwich that I'm able to produce would be better the longer the amount of time that I take. But then, of course, you'd look at this and you'd say, well, yeah, I'm hungry, so I can't wait. There's a cost to waiting. I need to have a sandwich in the present. Or why doesn't Volkswagen, if they can produce a better car, if they spend 2 years from R&D to having it roll off the assembly line, if 2 years allows them to produce a better car than 2 months does, why don't they just spend 10 years designing a car and getting the production process down pat and all those types of things? And then you would say, well, because they need to produce a car now, people are impatient. We want to have a car sooner rather than later. So it's obvious that the longest production process is not necessarily the ideal one for the economy, and we need a way for businesses, in particular in the economy in general, to decide how long a production process do we want to engage in. And the way that this is done is also through the interest rate, that the lower the interest rate, without getting into the details about it, the lower the interest rate, the longer will be the production process and the more satisfying the production good will be. And the higher the interest rate, the shorter the production process and the less satisfying the good that's created. So we go through the steps to show logically why this must be the case, why there's a relationship between the interest rate and the type of good which is being produced. and the length of the production process. And then we show why it is that changing the interest rate, like, for example, through the Federal Reserve, exogenously just reducing the interest rate, why this would wreak havoc on the economy. So I'll take you through a boom-bust cycle, as Austrians see it.
Yeah, sure.
So we've got the economy humming along okay, and the Federal Reserve decides to reduce interest rates. So one of the first things that you will see is that at the lower interest rate, consumers don't want to save so much money, they want to consume more. And this would make intuitive sense because it would be like going into your investment advisor and having your advisor say, well, last year there was lots of products that I could offer you that were 8% interest, and this year, the best I can do is 4%. Which is still pretty good compared to, I guess, what you get today. But by way of example, as the Fed drops interest rates, savers save less and they start consuming more. And businesses, for their part, they want to start borrowing more, as do individuals as well. We go to the bank, we take out a mortgage for the house, we take out a loan for the car. Borrowers go out and they borrow more funds at the same time that consumers are saving less. And so you can recognize this tension that the reduction in the interest rate has already, because it's causing, on one hand, savers to be saving less, and on the other hand, borrowers to want to borrow more. So we've got that going on. And at the same time, we've got businesses trying to understand, well, how long should my production process be? Like Volkswagen, should they devote more attention to research and development and have a longer amount of time before they produce a car, but it'll be a better car when it's produced? Or should they do less research and development, skimp on that, have a shorter production process, and get a car to market faster? Even though it'll be a lower quality car, at least it'll be to market faster. And so when Volkswagen looks at that dropping interest rate, they say, oh, well, it must be that we should be pursuing longer production processes. That's the signal that the interest rate provides. So Volkswagen responds by saying, okay, well, we need to spend more time making cars. We need to add what Austrians call stages of the production process. So maybe we need to devote resources to research and development, or to metallurgy, metal technology, to try to get the most satisfying metals to use in the car, things of this nature. So that's fine. That's going along for a while. And the economy really looks like it's booming because, of course, Volkswagen is expanding. They've got they're producing jobs over in their R&D development, so people are increasing their employment there. And at the same time, the lower interest rate caused consumers to consume more and save less. So businesses are doing very well on the other end of the spectrum. Consumers are going into stores and saying, hey, I want to buy more clothes, I want to get another new car this year, I want to buy more furniture for my house, things like that. So retail stores are doing very well selling to consumers, and the higher stages of production, like research and development, are doing very well because that's where businesses are expanding. Except there's a tension. And the tension is that consumers are not saving enough money to fund all this business activity. And it has to stop sooner or later. So, for example, what happens when interest rates increase? And when interest rates go up, that's what Austrians would define as being the start of the bust. Interest rates go up, consumers all of a sudden start saving more money and spending less, which starts hurting retail stores because fewer shoppers are coming through their doors. Like, people are buying a car less often, people are buying fewer pieces of new furniture or clothes for the house. And then as well, when interest rates go up, businesses look at where they should be investing. So in our example, Volkswagen would say, oh, we need a shorter production process, let's cut back on our research and development department. And so we would be laying off workers there and shortening up the amount of time that it takes for them to buy a car. So the recession, you see the economy get hit on both ends here. These very high stages of production, ones that are very far away from the final product that's being produced, like research and development is the best example. You see rising unemployment in those sectors of the economy. And then retail stores, you see rising unemployment and reduced business activity for them as consumers cut back on their consumption expenditures. So maybe to give you a concrete example, because Austrians commonly get chided for not using empirical data, look at the boom-bust cycle from the last recession we had with the housing crisis. When the boom was going on in the mid 2000s, interest rates were low. Consumers were consuming a lot and saving little. In the United States, we had a record low savings rate, and the stores business was very brisk. People were buying new clothes, new cars, things like that. And at the same time, houses are a very long-dated production process. Compared to, say, a ham sandwich, a house between the time when you break the land and have somebody actually move into it can be several years. And so we saw increased business activity in that as a specific long-dated production process. And then when the bust happened in late 2007, 2008, we saw unemployment in those two areas of the economy. The construction sector that was building long-dated investments like housing, all of those workers lost their jobs. And at the same time, since consumers were cutting back on their consumption expenditures, stores were also losing business, and we saw a rising unemployment there. So car companies had a hard time because that's a consumption expenditure, buying a car. Or stores where people would go to buy clothes, they were also having a hard time. We saw sales clerks losing their jobs, or restaurants, waiters and waitresses losing their jobs as people cut back on those types of expenses.
All right, so two terms that you alluded to in your answer there, but I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page because these terms do get thrown about quite a bit when the Austrian business cycle theory is discussed, and that's the cluster of errors and malinvestment. So can you just give a quick definition of what those two terms are? Yeah,
the cluster of errors is important because in the business cycle, it's not specific errors we're concerned with. Like, for example, let's see, who's got a new car out? I rented a car last month, and it was a Kia Soul, this very small SUV. It was okay, but I didn't think it was anything fantastic, and I don't think Kia will sell very many of that model. It's just not the right car for the American market, so I think anyway. And I would consider that a specific error by a specific company. It's misguessed, or it's misestimated what consumers are demanding, and it's produced the wrong type of good. Or a restaurant that opens its doors that doesn't have a good menu, or is just not the right type of restaurant for a town or city. That's a very specific error. Austrians talk about the cluster of errors, which is, why is it that in the boom and more particularly in the bust, why is it that in general all businessmen seem to be making an error at the same time? And it's a very good question because that's one of the defining characteristics of the business cycle is, in general, why are all people having good economic conditions, and then in the bust, why are all businesses facing tough economic conditions? And in answering that cycle, you would think, or answering that question rather, you would think that since we're looking at something that describes why many, many people or all people would make an error at the same time, you need to look at a factor that is causally related to everybody at the same time. So, of course, in the examples I just gave you, the demand for cars is something that affects car companies but doesn't really affect restaurants. The demand and the types of foods in a restaurant don't affect big box stores. Those are specific causal factors. But we need a causal factor that links everybody together, and that if we change that one factor, it would cause everybody to err at the same time. And the factor that Austrians look at is money, because money is the medium of exchange. It's the good that links every single person in the economy together at the same time. And money, as the case may be, if you want to describe it in terms of prices, one of its prices is the interest rate, because that's just the intertemporal price of money, right? If you save $100 this year, I'll give you $102 next year, and that would be an interest rate of 2%. And so the interest rate, in that brief expose of Austrian business cycle theory that I just took you through, the interest rate was the important price that was setting in motion the business cycle, and its changes to the money supply through the Federal Reserve, for example, that caused that interest rate to change. So we look at cluster of errors as, why is it that all businesses succumb to making the same types of error at the same time? And as the causal factor that is behind this, we look at money, since money is the factor that unites all of us in the economy. And the second term, which I did not throw around, but you bring it up, and it's a good word to bring up because it's one of the defining words of Austrian business cycle theory, is malinvestment. And when I started, I told you what Austrian business cycle theory is not, and I gave you a theory of overinvestment, like that somehow businesses are just investing too much, and we looked at why that was, not the greatest explanation for a business cycle. And in its place, Austrians talk about malinvestment. So Austrians say, no, it's not that there's too much investment taking place in the economy, it's that the wrong types of investment are taking place. So Volkswagen, in that example, did too much investment in research and development, and maybe they didn't do enough investment in other lines of business, maybe in their supply chain and their distribution network and their dealerships or something like that. So malinvestment is the term that Austrian economists use to describe the specific types of incorrect investments that investors are lured into making during the business cycle, during the boom in particular, in lieu of this alternative view which says, no, it's that the type of investment doesn't really matter. It's just that too much investment is taking place.
All right. So then what are some common objections to this theory, and what are some of the objections that we might hear from a proponent of Keynesian economics or of the Chicago School of Economics?
Well, I suppose to focus on Keynes would say, well, it's not that... It's not that anything bad was happening during the boom. The problem with the bust is that at the peak of the boom, investors lost their edge. And Keynes uses this term animal spirits to describe the propensity that businessmen have to invest. And he says, well, it's just guided by animal spirits. Like at some moments in time, investors are going out there and they're investing and business conditions are great. And then at other moments in time, it seems that investors retrench and they take their money out of the market. And we don't really know why this is. It's just animal spirits. It's psychological, but we don't know the basic reasons behind this. And so for Keynes, the business cycle is caused by investors retrenching and not wanting to lend their money to businesses to invest. And also it's consumers all of a sudden saying, no, we don't want to consume any longer. We want to cut back on our demands for these types of goods. And for the Austrian economists, the biggest problem that I have with this is that it's acausal. Like to say that investors lose their edge or their nerve and consumers don't want to buy anymore for whatever reason, but we don't know what that reason is, that's not satisfactory. In my mind, it's not scientific since there is no causal explanation, and it's not helpful either because it doesn't allow us to learn from the recession to try to avoid it in the future. Like for Keynesian economists, they would say the recession happened and it was unavoidable. Unavoidable in the sense that nothing wrong was happening during the boom. It just happened. It's just that people quit spending and that caused poor business conditions to result. While Austrian economists, they say, no, there had to be a causal reason for this. Nothing just happens without reason. And if we want to find out where that reason is, we need to look at the period of time previous to the boom, which is previous to the bust, which is the boom. We need to look at what's happening during the boom. Even though it looked like it was such a great business atmosphere, there must be something happening that's not sustainable. Something's changing in the economy that will eventually lead to a bust. So that would be the biggest difference between maybe Austrian economists and how Keynesians would look at the business cycle. Okay,
and since a lot of quote-unquote free market economists adhere to the Chicago School of Economics, can you briefly explain where the differences might be between their view of business cycle theory and the Austrian view?
Yeah, the Chicago School economist would be of the opinion that money doesn't really matter, that changes to the money supply can't really have any systemic effect on the economy. They use this term, they call it monetary neutrality. They say money is neutral when you change the quantity and it doesn't change relative prices. It's just it's neutral on the economy. There's no effect. And if that's the way that you look at the business cycle, then you'd say, well, it can't be a change in the money supply, which then changes the interest rate, which is really the key price in the Austrian business cycle. The Chicago School economists would say, no, it can't be that a change in the money supply has changed the interest rate in such a way that it's fouled up the economy, since money doesn't have any real effect on the economy. It's neutral. And in its place, they would say, but in the bust, we definitely need to look at the money supply as a way to avoid prolonging the bust. So in a famous quote, Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman is a fantastic free market economist. And when he looked at America's Great Depression, he said, well, the problem, really, there's no causal factor behind the recession. In other words, he doesn't answer the question of what caused it. Instead, all of his research was devoted to the actual depression itself and saying, well, what is the reason why it's so deep? Why is it so long? And his prognosis then was banks were going bankrupt and depositors were losing money, and we didn't have a way to backstop the financial system. And if we had have just done that, for example, if the Federal Reserve had just stepped in, then the Great Depression would not have been so great. But this is only half the story, of course, because sure, one half of the story in the Great Depression is why was it so long? Why was it such a difficult period of time? The more important question should be why did it happen at all? But the Chicago School economists would not focus on that question. Instead, they would try to answer that question. Well, how do we stop it, or how do we make it less bad once the recession already happened?
Okay, so one final question for you. How can we use Austrian economics, and in particular Austrian business cycle theory, to explain where we are right now and what's happened in the last few years?
Well, when I try to think about it in the simplest terms possible, Austrian business cycle theory, and I look for specific things that one could be looking for during an economic boom that would suggest that it's not sustainable, I would look for things like, consumers are really consuming a lot and saving a little. And of course, that's a relative statement relative to all the investment that businesses are doing. So typically, if businesses are doing a lot of business investment, it's because they're able to borrow funds to do so. And the reason there's a lot of funds to be borrowed must be because consumers are not consuming and instead they're deciding to save their income. That's the normal state of affairs. But if you see a situation where consumption seems to be very robust, restaurants are doing well, car companies, everybody's got a new car, things like this, and at the same time businesses seem to be able to invest a lot, or actually are investing a lot, that would be a sign that we've got this tension during the boom, that there's something which is non-sustainable, the non-sustainable thing being high consumption at the exact same time as high investment. Or to go along with that, you would look at what types of investment are taking place. So are the investments in simple things that are short-dated, short investment projects? Something like, a business repaving its parking lot so that it's a little bit more comfortable for customers to come to the store. Or is the investment that the business is doing very far off in the future, very far away from a final finished consumer good? Like, for example, is it in research and development that is not going to pay off for decades? So, for example, right now I look at a lot of research and development taking place that seems, incidentally, to also coincide with the fact that interest rates are very low, by the way. Much research and development which is directed at investment projects that will not mature until so far in the future that it's difficult to say if they'll ever be profitable. And of course, then you can get into all sorts of high-tech projects that, after the fact, we know they were never profitable. But right now, there's many that you could be looking at that you would really question: will they ever turn a profit? Or if they do, will it be soon enough to make the investment actually worthwhile?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. We obviously covered a lot of information in this episode, so if someone listening to this wants to learn more about the topics we've been discussing, what resources or readings would you recommend they take a look at? Well,
I would recommend two websites. I write predominantly for Mises Canada, which is at Mises, MISES.ca. Another good resource is another Mises Institute, the Mises Institute in the United States, and their website is Mises.org. MISES.org. So I would encourage interested listeners to check out either of those websites for more information. It is a very complicated topic. Business cycle theory is maybe the most complicated because it draws on many smaller economic theories that we didn't have time to get into. But I really would encourage anybody who wants to get a better understanding of what's going on in the economy. Are we, is the situation sustainable? Are we due for another recession? To really look up Austrian business cycle theory and see what it's all about, and see that it tells a consistent and logical story that's also that's also intuitive. I think it accords with what most people would think the problem is with the boom and the bust.
And beyond just the Mises Canada and Mises Institute websites, which of course will be linked to from the show notes page, but is there a particular article or book that you would recommend someone take a look at?
Well, there are two books in particular that I would recommend. Both of them, one is available online for free. So maybe the most influential book for me in understanding Austrian business cycle theory was a book by a Spanish economist. His name is Jesus Huerta de Soto. And Huerta de Soto wrote a book called Money, Credit, and Economic Cycles. And it's available as a free download in PDF format on the Mises.org website. So Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles would be the first book. And the second book that I would recommend, it's for purchase only, I don't believe there's a free version online, is an Austrian school economist at Auburn University in Alabama, Roger Garrison. And Roger wrote a book called Time and Money about 15 years ago now, or exactly 15 years ago, actually. And Time and Money is probably the single best read, and it's not especially long, but it goes into a very simple understanding of Austrian business cycle theory. And then when you want to learn more, it also has at the end more in-depth chapters that are a little bit more complicated and maybe for the more interested reader. But Roger Garrison's Time and Money is also an excellent book for that.
Okay, sure. And what are the best ways to follow your work in particular?
My work, well, like I say, I edit the Journal of Prices and Markets. We have a new issue of the journal coming out in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. I write for Mises Canada. I'm also involved with Mises.org, Mises USA. And if anybody's in the Toronto neighborhood, any of your listeners, we have a conference called the International Conference of Prices and Markets, and that is this November, the 4th and the 5th, which is a Friday, Saturday, in Toronto. Details of that are on the Mises Canada website, mises.ca.
Okay, great. Well, I want to encourage everybody to take a look at the show notes page for today's episode. wakeupcallpodcast.com/Austrian-cycle is that page, and of course there will be links to Mises Canada and to the Mises Institute in the United States, and to those two books that we were discussing, that were mentioned rather, the Money, Credit, and Economic Cycles book by Jesus Huerta de Soto and Time and Money by Roger Garrison. And also there will be a link to the Prices and Markets Journal. So the place to go for this episode is going to be wakeupcallpodcast.com/Austrian-cycle. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so that you can make sure to catch all the episodes and stay up to date on what's happening with the show. And Dave, thank you so much for joining me. This is a very complicated yet important topic, so I'm glad we were able to at least get our feet wet here and get some basic explanations and examples. And hopefully you'll be able to come back sometime soon and we can flesh this out a little more and maybe focus on some other topics or some more advanced topics.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot, Adam.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.